I'm David Morley. I'm an electronic music producer, and this is my studio. I use analog synthesizers quite a lot in my music, and these days to interface them with the computer, I still use CV gate, which is the old system of voltages, and you use a MIDI converter to convert it from MIDI to voltage. So this is my vintage CV gate interface, and as you can see you have positive and negative, and Moog systems use negative gates. So if I want to connect the mini Moog, I use that one, but most other synths use a positive gate. So this is the trigger. That patch goes somewhere in here into this gate input 4, and then I can take gate 4 and patch it to wherever I want on the synthesizer. So for the minute, this is now triggering this envelope generator. So that's how that unit works. There's also another one over there, a more modern one, and I'm using that to control the ARP and the VCS3. But I still use CV gate, and what that means is for every octave that comes out via MIDI, there is 1 volt of difference. So the oscillators on a vintage synth or any analog synth will usually be scaled so that for every voltage increase, every single volt increase, there's an octave. So if you have 0 volts, it's the lowest note. 5 volts will be 5 octaves higher. And a gate will trigger the envelopes or anything you need to trigger. For example, you can also trigger drum machines or whatever. It's very simple, really. Every parameter that can be controlled will be voltage controlled. So depending on how many outputs your CV gate box has, that's the number of parameters that can be controlled. And some synths are very simple, and some are much more complex. Here you can control much more parameters. Basically, any control input can be sent a voltage to control it. That also includes the envelope generators. You can apply a voltage to each of the parameters. This is the delay, this is the attack, the decay, the sustain, and the release. So each of those can also be controlled. So if I want it to have a slower attack, I can do it manually, or I can patch a voltage here and add more voltage to make the attack slower. So that's how I interface them with the computer. I actually got into analog synths because they were cheaper than digital synths. You know, I'm that old that I can remember when analog synths were undesirable. So, but then it became a bit of an addiction, but I've cut back to what I consider, you know, for me are either very useful machines or a few of the classic synthesizers. So this is the ARP Odyssey. It's one of my favorites. It's just a very simple duophonic synth, which means you can play 2 notes at once, but fundamentally it's better as a mono synth. It was kind of the ARP competitor to the Mini Moog, which is probably the most famous analog synth, and was basically a cut-down version of the Moog Modular in a preset format. This is a very early one. When they say RA Moog, it's one of the first 100 built. The components inside are based around the modular system, and later they actually redesigned the circuit boards. So this is quite it's a nice sounding one. It's the nicest sounding Mini Moog I've had. And basically the ARP Odyssey was the competitor to the Mini Moog, and I find the ARP more flexible, but the Moog has a very classic, rich sound. Then there's the Prophet 5, which is my favorite polysynth. It's a 5-note polyphonic. It was the first synthesizer that was polyphonic and had memories, built by Dave Smith, who still makes instruments today. And it's just a wonderful sounding synthesizer. Then there's the 808, still my favorite drum machine. Just a classic machine, and you can use it in all styles of music. Then the Polyfusion, which we've covered. Then my ARP. Again, my favorite synth for working. And Oberheim expander. It's my only other poly synth. So it's 6-voice polyphonic. You actually have 6 separate outputs, and you can treat it as 6 monophonic synths as well as a polyphonic synth. So it takes MIDI. You can put each voice on its own MIDI channel and have 6 completely different sounds playing simultaneously. That's the VCS3. It's the oldest synth here. It's from the early 70s, probably 71. They first came out in 69, I think. And it's for all those classic German Berlin school ambient pieces like Klaus Schulze and Tangerine Dream, which is probably still my favorite era of music, is the early 70s, especially the German krautrock. Then some relatively boring things, but these are quite rare. They're called, they were by a company called DS Tech, and it's called the Original Sin, and it's a monosynth. It's based around the classic Minimoog style synth. It's completely analog, but MIDI controlled. The company asked me to help with the presets and with basically when they were defining how the synth should be built. So they gave me the prototype, and then I bought another one off of eBay. And if you see one, buy it. Very good. This is a Yamaha FM synth, very rare, very weird. It's just before the DX7 style synths came out, but it's a brilliant sounding FM synthesizer, so nothing analog, but it still sounds great. Serge was in America in the early 70s. He worked at a university, and he was a Russian, someone of Russian descendancy, and he started building modular synths. And the deal was that the university students, he would help them build a synth, so they were all built by students. So this is one of the first Serge systems. Very, very crazy synth. It needs a service, and they're still going today. Different people run it, but you can still buy a new Serge system. They're just extremely expensive. But this was built by students who were probably stoned, and I love it. As you can see, this guy was really out of his head. He started putting kind of gothic artwork in it. Then a couple of drum machines, which I have to mention. The Roland R8, one of the best drum machines built. If you get one, you'll see why. It does very complex. You can control parameters. It's a very deep drum machine, much deeper than most people think. And then the Akai MPC-60, which is a sampling drum machine, a great MIDI sequencer as well, but it sees very little use these days. So this is my Polyfusion. Polyfusion were built by some Moog workers. They left Moog in the late 70s, and this is from, I think, 79 or something like that. And it was basically people who worked at Moog and thought they could build a better one, and I think they did. I'll show you how to make a fundamental patch on any modular system will be basically the same as this. These are the oscillators. I start with an oscillator. Let's take a sawtooth output from this oscillator, and I'll put it in the low-pass filter. Then the low-pass filter I'll put into a voltage-controlled amplifier over here. So the output always going to the input, and then the output of the amplifier can go to the mixer. This is one mixer, and that's the output to my mixing desk. There are various mixers, but for the minute this is basically a very simple patch. So here is the voltage controlled amplifier. I've turned it up because there's no voltage going into it, so if I keep that down I would have to apply a voltage for it to sound. The filter. Now obviously you can't really play it unless you attach a keyboard to it somehow, and also it's just droning on its own. So what I want to do is to close the amplifier and patch in an envelope generator to open the amplifier whenever I trigger the generator. So I take the output of the envelope generator and put it to the control input of the amplifier. Now if I trigger the envelope, it will make the oscillator sound. Now the gate input, what I can do is route it from the keyboard, so every time I touch any key, it triggers the envelope. To do this, I have the output, the gate output of the keyboard going to the gate input number 1. And I can just take gate input number 1 from here, and in theory, now the problem is the keys aren't, the oscillator isn't responding to the voltage from the keyboard. So now I have to patch the keyboard into the frequency control of the oscillator. And the keyboard is coming into controller 1, which is here. There's one patch cable is playing around with us somewhere. There we go. Now what would be nice would be for the filter to open automatically. So now I'm going to trigger the second envelope generator from the keyboard. Again, I can use gate number 1. And as we can see, it's being triggered. And now I'll patch the output of this envelope generator to the control input of the low-pass filter. That's just the basic patch, but you can go very experimental. There's all sorts of interesting modules in this system. So this is probably my favorite synth, and it's the ARP 2600. And it's probably my favorite because I know it inside out. I've used it on virtually every production I've done. And the best thing about it is it's not just a great synth. It's great for making, for me it's the best synth for making percussive sounds, but also for processing vocals, drum loops, whatever. It's really an incredible synthesizer. So this is my favorite bass drum. It's absolutely incredible. It's hard to explain how physically violent that sound is, but on big systems, it just... So what I'm actually doing is, the filter is self-resonating. So if I take the filter directly out, that's the filter. So it's basically making a sine wave. It's self-oscillating. Then the output is going into the preamplifier, which is kind of distorting the sine wave. And on the ARP you can choose a different amount of gain here. And of course I've got it on times 1,000, as you have to. And then the output is simply going to the output. So all it is a sine wave that's being amplified by the preamp. And then I'm triggering the filter with the envelope generator. So that's my favorite bass drum. My problem with aggressive sounds is it's easy to be aggressive, and lots of modern kind of digital like virus synths, you know, the virus and they're great synths, but when they get aggressive, they just get nasty. This gets aggressive, but it's fat and warm and full, and it doesn't lose any of the niceness, but it becomes really, you know, aggressive and violent.